Good afternoon. I'm really personally so pleased to be here. I think this is a really vital moment in international health, in nutrition, in development, in shaping the future of such an important part of our lives as food and nutrition. And what I'm going to do is to share with you some thoughts I have about the emergence of transformative movements in the area of agriculture, food, health, and nutrition. And then what I'd like to do is to take my understanding of what's happening and apply it very specifically to EAT and to this forum. Perhaps, therefore, offering some ideas about the way in which this process could move forward in coming years. I'm not going to show a PowerPoint, which means that I will talk slower, perhaps, than one usually does, because I want you to be able to follow my logic, but also, hopefully, it will make it easier for us to travel together. And if I see you looking at all confused or concerned, I'll wind the tape back a bit and go back again, still sticking in within my time. I want to start by talking about a conference that took place in Rio de Janeiro in 2012 called the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development. It was nicknamed Rio+20. And the purpose of that conference was to begin to map out a future of the world in which the three dimensions of sustainable development were given maximum emphasis: the economic, the human, and the environmental dimensions. And the idea behind the Rio+20 conference was that it was important to interweave these three dimensions so that they become inseparable in shaping the future of our world. It took governments quite a long period of negotiation to reach agreement during that meeting in Rio. It was in June 2012. And in fact, there were some shortcuts that had to be taken by the government of Brazil to help us reach agreement. But once there was agreement, the decision then was to create a process to establish sustainable development goals for our world from 2015 onwards, what's sometimes referred to as the post-2015 development agenda. We'll have a panel about that shortly, and many of the people who will talk on that panel are real experts on the issue. I just want to pick out some features of what's happened since that conference in Rio as governments have come together and tried to decide what the new development agenda might look like. Firstly, there's absolutely no doubt that when you bring together the different elements of sustainable development and you say there should not be a choice between whether a development path is environmentally sound, economically sensible, or in tune with human needs, but instead that all the choices should encompass all those dimensions, then you create some very difficult challenges for governments. Governments that have, during the last 22 years, been quite used to the idea that choosing development alternatives involves very difficult trade-offs. But instead, what's happened, as governments have met in New York and tried to negotiate the future, they have started to develop a really interesting and new way of thinking, which actually does combine the three elements of sustainability. And it goes further than that. It recognizes that you can't divide development into nice, stovepiped, clean areas, a bit like what did happen under the Millennium Development Goals that we've been working on between 2000 and 2015. Instead, what's happened as the governments and their negotiators have met in New York is they've realized the interlinkages between all aspects of development, and that not only are they interlinked, but they're interdependent. It was a little bit like Sonia Nishtar was saying in the earlier panel. When she went into government in Pakistan, she was surprised by, in a way, the inappropriate separation of different government ministries, when in reality, people's lives were mingling all the different elements together. Another thing that's come out of the discussions on the future of sustainable development is a real questioning about the usefulness of institutions that exist in today's world to help to advance global affairs. My own organization, the United Nations, comes in for regular criticism. But also, people are looking at national governments. Are we really well served by having national governments dividing business into health, education, agriculture and food, interior affairs, and so on? The result is, I think, one of the most exciting moments in the charting of the history of the world, that actually in New York, governments are beginning to question whether or not our model for thinking about development is the right one, whether the separations are appropriate, or whether a much more linked, interdependent, and transformative approach to the future is going to be necessary. We've seen this start to happen in the area of agriculture and food, when in 2008 food prices started rocketing upwards, and we had rises of rice and maize and so on of somewhere in the region of 30% in 2 or 3 months. It became clear that food systems weren't working. And it also became clear that it was not right to respond to this just simply by moving food around the world and providing food aid. But actually there were some underlying structural problems in world food systems that needed attention. And picking up again on what happened in an earlier panel just now, there was a recognition that you can't just talk about food security, you must focus on nutrition outcomes. And if you're focusing on agriculture, food security, and nutrition, you must incorporate thinking about climate and work on agriculture that is climate sensitive. And then linking that together, you must also look at issues like food waste, smallholder productivity, and most importantly, the sustainability of agriculture. And that recognition of interconnections, which in the agriculture and food space has really become strong since 2008, is just one example of where global governance is having to be rethought because of interdependence and because so many different groups have to be involved. There's another development that has really built up in the last 5 years, which is a recognition that whilst governments have to be at the center of all policies, because they are the duty bearers who are responsible for ensuring that their citizens' rights can be realized, there is a big, big role for civil society, for youth, for faith groups, for business, in the case of agriculture and food, for farmers, and other groups to be participating, if not in policy formulation, at least in the implementation of policy and in the actions that are needed for the future of our world. This engagement of multiple stakeholders is more than public-private partnerships. It is a recognition that in real life, it is collective action by multiple groups towards clear and agreed goals that is the key to the future. Some of us have started to use the term movements to describe it. We've had a description of a movement earlier today, but there are now an increasing numbers of movements that involve multiple stakeholders emerging in many, many areas. They create big challenges for governance. Governing a movement of multiple actors is not an easy process, but at the same time, provided there is the kind of radical transparency that Peter Bakker referred to yesterday, there is at least the beginnings of a possibility that these collective ways of working will be able to function, and provided there is strong civil society and a good and free media, then accountability and legitimacy can be maintained to a degree. if this is the kind of way in which things are going to go in the next few years, if this is the kind of world that we're going to see, where of course governments will be in the primary role, but at the same time there will be movements for change in many different areas, how can we in this room, as a group, contribute in this very tricky area of the relationship between agriculture and food, what we eat, whether or not we're healthy, and whether or not also our planet has a long-term future? I'd like to offer a few suggestions now. Joe Jewell, I don't know whether you're here. Are you here, Joe? From WHO Euro. I'm going to just quote back at you something that you said earlier today because it was really interesting. You said, I'm a doctor and I see things wrong and I would like to see them changed, but sometimes because the political process isn't working in the way that it's necessary, it's very difficult to bring about these changes, and I get pessimistic. And I think that this must be a feeling that many in this room have from time to time. You see things wrong, you know they've got to change, but you can't find the right buttons to push or the right techniques to use to bring about the kind of political change that is necessary. And yet this forum has the potential to become truly transformative if it is able, by bringing together people with power and influence from a variety of different sectors and spaces, if it is able to gather the collective energy of the individuals and make it become synergized so that that energy is greater than the sum of the individual parts. Are there potential ways in which this group can transform into a movement that will trigger changes in patterns of dietary consumption, patterns of food retailing, patterns of food production? Well, let's think it through. I think that a starting point must be that we are in this together and we're going to work together, but we're not necessarily going to position ourselves as primarily in a position of authority where we will tell others what to do. By and large, in our experience, that style, which of course people in public health are familiar with, doesn't work very well. So the first requirement is that instead of the starting mindset being we must tell them that they must change, the starting mindset probably has to be, we will seek ways to catalyze change. And the way in which many people have spoken during this forum, I think, have shown what is particularly important if we're going to be catalysts. To be catalysts, we have to be humble, but we have to be courageous. Humble because if you're a catalyst, you're relying on others to do the work. Courageous because sometimes you have to take quite big risks to do it. I think this forum will show that individuals within it and the forum as a whole has the kind of courageous humility that may be necessary if it's going to be able to achieve significant change. It's also going to be a forum in which there will be a willingness of people to give to each other. The term mentoring was used earlier this afternoon. Mentoring is absolutely critical because each of us has something to offer the other, and if we can support each other, then bringing about change is much easier. Those of us who work in the international system know that that's quite a rare characteristic, generous mentoring. The norm in bureaucracies is that people try to slice the legs off each other, but I think that in this room, that is not the mindset that we're seeing. Of course, if we are going to stimulate some of the changes that have been discussed during the forum, we will all have to step out of our comfort zones. We have to be willing to combine science with emotions. We have to be ready to listen rather than prescribe. And we have to avoid being stuck in our own professional straitjackets, realizing that whilst I might be an expert, for example, in public health, I know so little about how to run hotels or other such things, and I have much to learn from others. So if we're going to be able to advance and become a movement for change, we also have to widen the critical mass. We have to engage with new forces. We must resist the temptation just to talk with or work with those who agree with us. We must be prepared to step out and work with people who often hold radically different opinions. We have to get the narrative right, and that's really important. As again we've heard today, communications is the absolute heart of our work. And then at the same time, we have to avoid being predictable or boring as we communicate. We must certainly not recite, and we must be very careful on moral outrage, because one person's moral outrage is another person's stock in trade. Obviously, each of us has our own programs and projects and institutional identity and flag that we need to fly, and that's desirable. But inside a forum like this, whether or not I work for the United Nations or she works for a particular company or he works for a particular NGO, whilst it's a significant defining feature for ourselves, cannot be what it is that makes us useful in working together in a movement for change. So let us say that EAT does become a multi-actor movement for change. What are the key steps that need to happen over the next few years for it to be truly transformative? Well, first of all, I think a little bit of focus on where and how to work. I think if the movement is going to fundamentally be about food systems for sustainable and healthy diets, and then as a result of those sustainable and healthy diets, it's food systems for better health of people and planet, then the only way this group can work is by focusing on interfaces between sectors, on interfaces between institutions, on interfaces between countries, so that at all times we're going to places that sometimes the normal bureaucracies can't touch. Interface working, as I think many of us have realized over the years, is where some of the greatest gains are to be made. The style of working is always to inspire each other to do better, to give each other strength and courage, to engage on each other's terms, always to discourage fragmentation and the kind of rows that happen when fragmentation exists. We must be knitters and weavers, creating patterns and mosaics that are in tune with the kind of transformations in life that we believe to be important. We must accept that if we work in a movement, sometimes our style of working will be organic and uncontrolled. It won't fit nicely into any box. But that's the way in which transformation happens. We're going to have to watch it, because creating movements and then operating in movements puts huge pressures on standard institutions, whether they be government ministries or university departments or United Nations bodies like the ones in which I work, because those institutions define themselves by the compartments in which they sit. But the EAT movement will not define itself by being compartmentalized. It'll define itself by the goals to which it is moving, and it'll define itself by the fact that it works outside compartments, which means that from time to time people will get attacked, they'll get questioned about legitimacy, there'll be questions about whether or not their science is right, there'll be questions about whether particular activist lines are being pursued. But that's all right, as long as there is the radical transparency that Peter Backer required, and as long as there is true 360-degree accountability. So, ladies and gentlemen, I put it to you that there is a real potential for EAT, if it continues with the style of these 2 days, to become a transformative movement for healthy diets and for a healthier planet. It will need, over time, through the advisory board and others, to establish some goals, some areas of focus, some ways of bringing in more, particularly from countries that are not represented here or communities that are not represented here. And it will need to identify some initiatives that can become the successful flagships. And those are part of normal work. But the most important thing is stay at the interfaces, stay outside the compartments, be strong mentors of each other, support each other, 360-degree accountability, and avoid being boxed in any kind of institutional framework. Thank you very much indeed for the chance to say these words.